Welcome to Borders and Belonging, a podcast that explores issues in global migration and aims to debunk myths about migration based on current research. This series is produced by CERC Migration and Democracy. I'm Maggie Perzyna, a researcher with the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration Program at Toronto Metropolitan University. Today, we're going to delve into Brexit, the 2016 referendum vote, where 52% of the voters in the United Kingdom decided the UK should leave the European Union. Many believe concerns about immigration and migration are what drove those results. In this episode, two leading experts will weigh in on the powerful rhetoric and myths about migrants that influenced how Britons voted, and if those views are still held today. But first, we'll speak to someone who has seen firsthand the effects of Brexit on migrant communities in the UK. Alexandra Bulat had been living in England for 4 years when the Brexit referendum happened. After getting over the initial shock of the UK's decision to leave the European Union, she came to the realization that her experience as a Romanian in the UK had been different in so many ways from many of her fellow students.
What was really interesting for me was how after finding out the result of Brexit, how a lot of my friends who are from Western European countries, so my friends who were then students from France or Germany or other countries, felt quite shocked by the result. And they were saying, well, it's the first time I feel like I'm a migrant in the UK, like I'm not welcomed or I'm not wanted in the UK as a person. And for me personally, of course, I moved in the UK in 2012, so 4 years before the referendum. And to be honest, I have always felt as a migrant because I did encounter people who had quite negative views about Romanians. It was not as if we were all in this big EU family of everyone liking each other.
The more Alexandra thought about this discrepancy between how she and her friends felt, the more she realized that there was a difference in the national rhetoric surrounding migrants from different places.
There was this kind of constructed hierarchy of some migrants from certain countries are less desirable perhaps than others. Like we do prefer, for instance, having the brightest and the best, as the rhetoric goes in the government, the brightest and the best migrants coming in the UK and working specific jobs that are associated in kind of popular stereotypes with specific nationalities. Whereas if you mention people working in construction, for instance, who are often branded as kind of those lower skilled, lower paid, undesirable migrants, you automatically in your mind think, it's the Polish construction worker or the Romanian construction worker.
The stereotypes made Alexandra feel uneasy. But in the face of Brexit, what was even more distressing and imminent was a question no one could really answer. What will happen to our rights?
At that point in 2016, in the aftermath of the referendum, no one knew the answer to that question. We just knew there would be a long period of negotiations. We knew that people's rights who are in the UK before Brexit will become bargaining chips in the negotiations. And some people didn't even know this. Some people actually wrongly thought they have to leave the UK or they can't continue their lives in the UK anymore. So there was a period of uncertainty, of deep uncertainty, and a period where everyone was quite anxious.
Even though she was worried, Alexandra also knew that she was lucky compared to many other EU migrants.
I was living in Cambridge. I was connected to a university. I was fluent in English. I had a lot of privilege that a lot of people, that I interacted with didn't necessarily have access to the same information. Our university informed us about Brexit updates and so on. So my first thing was how can I inform people around me who don't have the same access to information?
The first thing she did was sign up to volunteer with the 3 Million, a grassroots organization created to protect the rights of people who have made the UK their home. The more she worked as an activist, the more Alexandra realized that all the issues really boiled down to one thing: power. And that motivated her to keep going.
I think that's kind of what I was really focused on, what really made me passionate about activism is actually that information is power. And if you don't have information about your rights and you don't have accurate information about your rights in the UK, you're more likely to end up in exploitative conditions at work. You're more likely to be taken advantage of. You're more likely to end up in very precarious circumstances.
Throughout the course of her volunteer work, Alexandra also realized just how deeply many families would be affected by Brexit. especially families that didn't have enough access to information about the EU settlement scheme.
I always remember this example of this Romanian woman who came to an information stall I was volunteering at in Cambridge, where I live. It was before the pandemic. And then I double-checked, okay, you applied for status. She applied for the status. She got the status.
Then she asked the woman if she had children. The woman said yes. So Alexandra asked if her children had applied for status. The woman looked extremely confused.
There was this misassumption amongst many people I met that they're my children, the state knows they're my children, so they will automatically get this status. But in reality, it was a really stressful situation to come across this, because this meant that if this child, then they grow up, they're 16, they start their first job in the summer, and then they will be asked, please prove your right to work, where's your immigration status? And then they can find out often after many years in the country that they are actually unlawfully resident in the UK, and then effectively lose all their rights to rent, the rights to work, the rights to healthcare. So it is really, really worrying to think that perhaps, how many people are still in that circumstance.
In May 2021, Alexandra Bulat was elected as Labour councillor representing Abbey on Cambridgeshire County Council, where she continued to bring her lived experience and passion for migrants' rights to her work. Our thanks to Alexandra for bringing her perspective from the field. To discuss the tangled issues around Brexit and migration, I have Professor Bridget Anderson, Director of the Bristol Institute on Migration and Mobility Studies at the University of Bristol, and Professor Aija Lulle, Senior Lecturer in Human Geography at Loughborough University. Thank you both for joining me. Migration was a point of tension between the UK and the EU for some time before Brexit. How did migration factor into the British Leave campaign, and what fueled the swell of anti-migration rhetoric in Britain?
When we're thinking about how migration plays in Britain, I think particularly in England, I think that we do always have to think about race and how migrants are racialized, and how migration and nationality can be in some ways a coded way of talking about race. So I think that in the Leave campaign, in a way, there were two kind of aspects of it. So one was a kind of fantasy of Britain, its past glories, the British Empire, Britain ruling the world, but now we in inverted commas were part of the EU and a kind of sideline power. And the other was related, which has kind of obviously heavily racist implications. And then on the other hand, there was also this idea of that there were basically too many migrants coming to Britain, and that needed to be stopped in some way. And again, in inverted scare quotes, we needed to get control back of our borders. And those were both elements of those, which in some ways you could say were contradictory, were played on very heavily by the Leave campaign.
Yes. Yeah, I can just echo what Bridget just said. It's definitely we need to talk about racialization during the Leave campaign. And we need to talk about that migration was specifically made as a fundamental issue during the Leave campaign, precisely with these phrases and tropes about that Britain is full, that Britain is like a container that is full and overflowing, and getting our control back to our borders. And specifically, I want to say, as myself, I was born still during the Soviet Union times, and I did not choose where I was born, and I did not choose to be born in a totalitarian country that did not allow any migration. I really felt that our research participants, they experienced this racialization towards the Eastern European migrants.
Professor Anderson, you write a lot in your research about the fact that the preoccupation with migration during Brexit is really about global inequality. How do these tie together?
Well, so I suppose I think that it's, as I mentioned, I think that there is this sense of Britain becoming, as once ruling the world and becoming more marginalized. And I think that is something that is experienced by people in Britain as they see their lives getting tougher and their incomes declining, and the welfare state, which, let's not forget, was also kind of a product that was financed by imperialism, even though it's imagined as a kind of national achievement. But I think there was this kind of sense of decline and an increasing impoverishment. And I think that there is a sense in the UK of there basically being not enough to go around. And as you feel like, a sense of, well, I'm in a relatively rich country and yet I'm barely making do. And I look out at the rest of the world and see, hey, there's a lot of people who are a hell of a lot worse off than I am. And so I need to hold on to the little that I have. And I think that anxiety, which was deliberately fueled by the Vote Leave, by the different Vote Leave campaigns. And I think it is a component in fear of migration. So I think rather than looking out at the world and seeing what the challenges that people might have in common and seeing the kind of ever greater and increasing inequality between the super rich and the getting by as something which should, encourages allegiances and alliances with migrants, it was actually used to divide British citizens from migrants.
Professor Lulle, you referred to invisible migrants made visible after Brexit in your research. What do you mean by that? And what is life like for migrants after Brexit?
We are talking here about cultural racialization, ethnicization, because during the Brexit campaign, we clearly saw and we evidenced that specific ethnicities were highlighted, especially Romanians, others, and as not quite white, but also it went towards the Polish people and others. So seemingly European migrants, they could blend into British, quite invisible as being white, but then through this Brexit campaign, they were racialized and they were made visible through this cultural racialization and ethnicization.
After Brexit, after the referendum, how does the situation look today?
After the referendum, actually for many people, those young European migrants we interviewed, Brexit vote was a surprise. It wasn't a surprise for some, but many were surprised because they were sheltered in their communities or very international environment, because we interviewed people in London and metropolitan area, where many or most had international universities or even cafes they were working, or construction business. They were very international, and they did not think that it will happen. And then suddenly, over the night, the situation changed. What is important that many of our research participants, they said that prior to Brexit, they were not worried, but their racialized colleagues were worried. They were really anxious to work through the paperwork because they felt that this Brexit decision will affect them seriously. So it really underlines this argument that Brexit is about race and racialization. So the situation changed for people a lot because they had to gather all kinds of paperwork to prove that you can live in the UK. And so many people had families across the borders. So it was a dramatic change.
One thing I'd like to kind of put on the table is, of course, who are we talking about when we're talking about migrants, right? I mean, are we talking about people who are subject to immigration controls? Or are we talking about racialized people? And I think, when we're talking about migrants, there's I don't know, lots of US bankers working in London who are migrants. And yet I think kind of that's not who we're imagining when we're thinking about, post-Brexit migration and people's experiences. So I think that, thinking about that kind of more narrow group of migrants, which is basically thinking about people of colour and people of working class people, I would say that firstly, post-Brexit, and this kind of gets back to what we were both saying at the start of, that there was a vicious rise in racist attacks. And those racist attacks were directed both at people who were perceived as being from Eastern Europe, so-called, and people of colour. So it, to me, demonstrates, firstly, that yes, people from other EU member states were being racialized as not properly white, but also that this is a question of race. And then in terms of kind of what happened to actual migration, actually also, people have been both leaving and also kind of not coming from Europe. And that's had significant consequences for the British labour market. I mean, we're in the middle of an absolute disaster in terms of airports and flights. And I was listening to kind of some airport representative issue a plea to the government to allow for work permits for baggage handlers, because the baggage handlers were all from European countries, and now there are no people to work in baggage handling. So it's also the negative experiences of Brexit for migrant workers are also now having negative consequences for migrants and citizens alike who are still residing in the UK.
I could follow up a little bit on this question on everyday life after the Brexit. Bureaucracy very much kicked in after the Brexit, and all people, they became subject to all kinds of rules related to time. How long have you been living in the UK? And most importantly, they were subject to mobility rules, what we as the researchers call the mobility justice. So you really had to count every day, every trip outside to qualify for the permanent status and then to qualify for citizenship. And yes, indeed, many migrants went this route and they applied for citizenship and for the permanent status. And I'm following up and keeping in touch with research participants, and recently had a conversation. The person said that yes, they went for this citizenship option and paid lots of money, but now they feel that was it really worth it? They could have lived maybe as a permanent resident and not to have this British passport. And then others who had more precarious situations, they had their own private Brexits because simply they are subject to quite strict bureaucratic rules.
So take back control, British jobs for British citizens. These were some of the slogans around the Brexit Leave campaign. Did Brexit solve the issues it was supposed to?
Well, I suppose the question of, was there issues in the first place? And then did it solve it? So I think that, there was tremendous anxiety around Brexit. And again, I think this was largely got up about migrants taking so-called British jobs. Now, as we know, there's not a set number of jobs to go around the economy. It's not simply, you can't say that one person takes another's job in that kind of simplistic way. But what's noticeable is that whereas 10 years ago, there was some research which found that 1 in 4 people, that's right, in 2008, 1 in 4 people thought that migrants would contribute to kind of turning the economy around, and 2 in 4 thought that migrants were taking jobs from British workers. Now we're finding those figures reverse. That is, only a quarter of people think people are taking jobs, and half are saying that we need migrants for the economy. So I think what we've seen is that, it's really not the case that British workers will just walk into the jobs that migrants used to do. And having said that, I think it's also important to say this is not because, as many employers will argue, that British people are too lazy, they don't have the right work ethic, which is why we need migrant workers. No, it's for lots of complicated reasons, including the fact that, British people have families in the UK, that they're looking at their entire career trajectory. They're just very different they're in very different circumstances and imagine themselves very differently in the labour market. So I want to say that, it's not that British people are too lazy or that migrants are naturally hardworking, but it certainly hasn't. It's actually what we're seeing is labour shortages across the board in many so-called migrant sectors.
And these so-called issues were very much fabricated, I would say, during the Brexit campaign. So I could give some examples of so-called issues. Yes, that taking jobs, as Bridget said. Other issue, what was often mentioned, was that migrants are using our welfare system. And also another issue was about NHS, right? So from our research, robust quantitative data throughout the larger research we did, we can see that actually migrants underuse welfare system and don't claim benefits that they are entitled to, and they definitely underuse NHS. So in that sense, clearly fabricated issues that did not correspond to reality.
Professor Lulle, your colleague Russell King says that Brexit is a wicked problem, which is an unsolvable problem that in the end only causes more problems. Do you think that's true?
It's an interesting notion, and I think it is generative and productive to some extent. But I was looking also at the history of migration politics in the UK, and we can see that it comes in waves. And it also breaks in waves. We can see the correlation with conservative government. So we saw in the 40s, after the Second World War, we could see the Commonwealth countries, white people invited to come to the UK, Irish then coming in 40s, 70s. And then in 1971, we got the Immigration Act. Voila, we also had the conservative government, right? And the Commonwealth people were stripped of some of their privileges given previously. And then we saw joining the common market, European common market in 1973. And British people enjoyed being part of Europe in terms of migration. They enjoyed living or having transnational lives across the borders. And since the common market was much smaller, and it included Western European countries. So we also need to talk about racism and racialization also in Europe, not only in the UK. So it was relatively hush-hush, nice combination that we can live in Europe and you can come to the UK. But the problem started of the racialization and ethnicization with a large-scale influx of Eastern European migrants after the 2004.
Professor Anderson, what do you think? Do you think that Brexit is a wicked problem?
I think that Brexit is a wicked problem, yes, because I think that it's symptomatic of many other problems. So I think it's symptomatic of a deep-seated problem of English nationalism and the relation of England to the United Kingdom and sort of English self-perceptions. I think it's a problem related to empire and imperial nostalgia and the ways that Britain sees its role in the world. I think it's a problem related to industrial decline and actually politics that were really kind of go back to the 1980s and a sense of alienation and confusion and ressentiment. So I think that, yes, it is a wicked problem. And I think in turn it creates its own problems, but it is a wicked problem and it's a symptom of many other issues, but particularly I would say around economic questions and questions of race and racism.
So Britain's exit from the EU was finalized in 2020. Looking to the future of migration in Britain, what do you feel hopeful or inspired by?
I actually have a big hope and let's say quite immediate hope. And let me start with that short-term hope. I do hope that Britain and British people will reflect on the industry of hate and divisiveness which was created during the Brexit campaign in a very intense way. And they may do it together with colleagues and friends across the ocean in the US, because all this coincided also with electing Donald Trump. So self-awareness and critical reflection, I think, is very serious and important to move forward. And I have a large hope as well, because I teach intensely in my university. And I teach one module, for example, about post-colonial and post-social societies. And I was very delighted to be in my classes. I was very happy to be there because I really saw that my students are listening. They are engaged. They stay after the class. They want to discuss more. They want to see the similarities and differences. They want to see their role as a reflective persons soon entering into the so-called big world after the university. And also, I do see that we have more global universal problems to deal with, like climate change. And the biggest hope does come from the younger generation. And I think that our younger generation will come together, will see the value of togetherness and value of each other, and that we are all interconnected. And this will be the ethos how they will approach these questions.
One thing I feel both hopeful and inspired by is the bringing together, particularly in migrants' organisations, of questions of race and migration. So these they used to be very kind of interconnected in the 70s and 80s. They moved apart really from the 90s onwards. And now I think they're now kind of getting back into conversation with each other. And I think that's really, and more than conversation, into organising with each other. And I think that's really important. I can also see two other areas of hope that are also challenges. So one hope challenge is the preparedness to have difficult conversations. I think that Brexit really trained us for that, and we've only just begun. And I think that we need to be able to have more of these difficult conversations where we are able not to shout at each other, but to genuinely dialogue and learn from very different points of view and ways of being in the world. And relatedly, I think the politics of what you could call the politics of hinterlands, that is politics outside the city. I think that there's been a kind of tremendous fixation on cities, and this is not just in the UK, I think sort of more generally. I think that there is a lot to be learned from, to think about, by engaging with the politics of outside the cities, whether that's small towns or rural areas. So I see those both as offering exciting possibilities, as being challenges, but also in the end offering hope.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to finish. That leaves us something all to think about.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Professor Anderson and Professor Lulle for joining me today. And thank you for listening. This is a CERC Migration and Open Democracy podcast, produced in collaboration with Lead Podcasting. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe to Borders and Belonging on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Brexit, please visit the show notes. I'm Maggie Perzyna. Thanks for listening.